afternoon. And welcome. I'm Reverend Ed Horn. I'm the pastor at the United Methodist Church, Westport and Weston, and I'm the clergy co-chair of the Interfaith Council of Westport and Weston, which is sponsoring this event. This is the 9th year that we are sponsoring an event around the time of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s celebration, and we are delighted for the first year to be here in Norfield and Weston for this very special occasion. We're so excited to be helping to bring you this program, which is really the work of the Norfield Church and its staff and wonderful choir. I understand they have imported at least 1 or 2 guests to be in this choir. It's an interfaith choir, which is great, which is the spirit of the Interfaith Council. It's really a unique organization. Many communities such as ours have wonderful clergy interfaith groups, which we do, but this is a group, Interfaith Council, which is over 40 years old and is organized primarily by lay people along with clergy to help bring these kinds of events to our communities. So we're so happy and delighted to be a part of that today. And my counterpart, our lay co-chair who really makes everything happen in the Interfaith Council, Mary Nazio, is going to speak for a moment.
I just want to invite you to a wonderful reception following this wonderful concert, and it will be in the parish hall. If you will exit through the side door and turn left, you'll see a large white building. We'll have a wonderful buffet. Please come and join us so we'll have a little chance to discuss this great program.
Great programs like these involve a lot of work and also involve some financial resources. You may have noticed when you came in, and certainly you will notice when you go out, both in this building and in where the reception is, that there are some baskets. We do ask you to place some soft-sounding money into those baskets. The green stuff, or if you have a check, that's okay too, to help support this program and other programs by the Interfaith Council. It's a joy now to offer this program for all of us.
His mouth came fire and smoke. Looked all around me, it looked so fine, till I asked my Lord if all was mine. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Yes, every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. River is chilly and cold. It chills the body, but not the soul. There ain't but one train upon this track. It runs to heaven and right back. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Yes, every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I'll pray. Yes, every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Yes, I will pray.
The African American spiritual, earlier known as Negro spirituals, and before that as slave songs, is one of the most remarkable of all musical genres. The spirituals are a unique combination of the music and rhythms of Africa, influenced by Latin, South American, European, and early American music. Spirituals are the first uniquely American music that came out of our nation. These spirituals were created over a 200-year period, but not until the 19th century were most Americans even aware of their existence. This distinctive American music, so emotionally expressive, so rich and varied, is a testament to the slaves who created them. And these spirituals have enriched our culture. They speak to our collective heritage and, more importantly, to who we are as Americans. These spirituals lie at the heart of how Africans brought to these United States as slaves survived the dehumanization forced upon them under the harshest of circumstances. And today's program is meant to offer a context for these spirituals and how they became part of our culture and society. What makes spirituals unique is that they were part of a religious expression that slaves used to transcend the dehumanizing effects of their enslavement. And they were born out of the souls of human beings who were denied what our Declaration of Independence proclaimed to be in truth self-evident, that every human being is created equal, and every human being is endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This music transcended a people who had their heritage and history stripped raw, or so the slave masters thought, and where they had no freedom but the freedom in their souls. And so these slaves expressed that you can't take from me my real freedom through songs of their souls. These spirituals connected slaves with the God who affirmed their humanity in the face of inhumane treatment. Throughout history, from the time the Hebrew people were made slaves in a land called Egypt, to human trafficking today, and may I say something I just discovered yesterday, one of the daughters of this very congregation, Katie Mitchell, who interned last year at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, and she is currently a student at Rice University, and she is in the forefront of working for the estimated 27 million people enslaved today as the president of Rice University's Free Slavery Project. Voices have always been raised to God in song that in themselves are without color, nationality, or gender. Think about what we witnessed just 3 years ago in the ancient land of Egypt, when hundreds of thousands of Egyptians gathered in Cairo's Tahrir Square singing songs of freedom in the tradition that came out of Africa and the Middle East, in the manner of non-violent champions of the past like Gandhi and King. Those Egyptians in Tahrir Square felt the spirit of freedom, and their voices challenged decades of tyranny, and we were living witnesses to those Egyptian voices as they cried out their longing for freedom and stood down in army. And I can just imagine them singing this old Negro spiritual, "Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go."
Moses,
I am the grandson of a slave. My grandfather was born in 1859 and was 4 years old when Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was signed into law. My dad was 12 when my grandfather died at the age of 72, which means there is only one generation separating me from the history of our nation's enslavement of its own people. So slavery is not just African American history, it is American history. And for people like me, slavery is part of my family's history. And it is a history that we as Americans should never forget, because slavery had a devastating and still resonating impact on our nation and who we are as Americans, one and all. The history of slavery in America began on those ships that brought those first Africans and the institution of slavery to our shores. Imagine, if you will, that one day you are under the hot sun of West Africa with your family. You are eating, drinking, laughing, loving, working, and doing all the things free people have done for all of human history. Suddenly, you are taken, whipped, bound in chains, and stacked like wood upon other people on a ship in roiling waters where you are sicker than you ever imagined. Let me talk just a little bit about those ships. Imagine people. They were, after all, human beings, held captive aboard these cargo vessels and crammed so close together there was no space to change position by day or night. These people, different only in color from other people, were bound in chains aboard these ships that were bound for these American shores in what can only be described as inhuman holding spaces on those ships for 23 of the 24 hours they were at sea. And they were let out of this confinement and allowed to walk on deck 1 hour a day. And even then, they were still bound in chains to one another. They were tattooed with so-called merchant marks, or stated more accurately, they were branded like cattle with red-hot irons on their naked bodies because they were not only in captivity, they were property, things to be bought and sold at will. Those African slaves boarding those ships had no idea what lay ahead for them as they sailed away from the continent of their birth, because no African who made the journey on what is known as the Middle Passage, so called because it was the middle leg of a three-part voyage, no African who ever made the journey ever returned to tell what happened. The Middle Passage, so called, was part of a triangle that began when ships departed Europe for African markets with goods, which were traded for kidnapped Africans, who were then transported across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, as slaves, and then were sold for raw materials, which was then transported back to Europe to complete the triangular voyage. It is reported that during this infamous so-called Middle Passage, 15%, that's almost 2 million of these captive slaves died on the way to the so-called New World. They died not on a road to freedom, but on a journey to enslavement. It is said that sharks followed those ships the entire journey, waiting for the dead bodies that were continually thrown overboard when those first Africans came ashore in America. They were subjected to the most inhumane treatment ever known to humankind, all the while hoping, all the while praying and singing songs of freedom, freedom, oh freedom. Oh. slaves chose death to a life of captivity, proclaiming, "And for I be's a slave, I be's buried in my grave, and go on home to the Lord and be free." Once they came ashore in America, they were separated from loved ones, sold to the highest bidder, and forced to work in a land they'd never seen, knew nothing about, and compelled by the threat of death to obey orders in a language they'd never heard. When those first Africans arrived in this so-called New World, they entered a strange and peculiar culture and civilization. The civilization these captive Africans were compelled to accept, the world they were forced to enter, bound in chains, was a dualistic, double-thinking, Eurocentric society. It was a civilization which saw the world as either or. Your color was either white or black. Your economics, you were either rich or poor. Your morality was either right or wrong. Your actions were either good or bad. Your intent was either holy or evil. Your alliance was either with God or with Satan. Your salvation, you were either a saint or a sinner. And since all of those African arrivals to this new world were on the or side of this society's equation, in other words, they were the or black, the or evil, the or poor, the or sinner, the or wrong, the or bad. Since all of the first African arrivals were on the or side of this society's equation, these people, different only in their skin color, were condemned to a life of slavery and servitude, both by custom and by law. And they had to discover a means of surviving. And because they didn't want to forget the land of their birth, they were inspired to create songs to remind them both of their home across the river and the home they believed they would get to one day. They called that home the place where the wicked would cease their troubling and the weary would find their rest. Now, the slave master believed spirituals were just songs that kept the slave happy. And because the master didn't understand their songs, slaves could sing with abandon, and sing they did, with deep feelings about a life different from the one they were living, and a home, their real home, where there was freedom and joy, a home that was across a river, a deep, deep river. Deep River is what is known as a cold spiritual. It spoke about the river that would take slaves home to freedom in heaven, but it also spoke about the rivers that needed to be crossed to get to freedom in this life. So when they sang about the Jordan River, it might be cold from the Mississippi River, and it meant that it was time to take that journey on the road to freedom on the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad, as most of you know, was neither a railroad nor underground, but was a network of people, churches, and other organizations helping slaves escape on the road to freedom to all states north and to Canada. The Underground Railroad moved hundreds of slaves northward each year. It's no wonder that these spirituals are so connected to the Underground Railroad, which ran through numerous towns right here in Connecticut. And, quiet as it's kept, just a few years ago, when we were renovating our sanctuary here at Norfield, we found a space right beneath this pulpit where I am standing now that could well have been used as a hiding place on the Underground Railroad. We can't prove it, but then no Underground Railroad space can be proven because the nature of the Underground Railroad system used to hide slaves as they fled captivity was supposed to be secret. The conductors involved in the Underground Railroad left no written record, no tracks for authorities to trace, so that no one would ever know it was one of the stops on the journey. But it would not surprise me that this community, and this congregation in particular, could have been involved in offering a safe haven to those traveling on the road to freedom. We also know that towns right here in Connecticut, Wilton, New London, and Old Lyme, were part of the Connecticut Underground Railroad, and that's something to be proud of. Having said that, slavery was a legal and systematic attempt to obliterate the Africans' sense of their culture, their heritage, their identity, and their personalities. Slaves were not permitted to speak their native language. Slaves couldn't even worship the gods of their ancestors. They were forbidden to demonstrate any cultural expression that bore resemblance to the land of their birth. Slaves were not allowed to use their African names. One of the first things that happened to Africans once they arrived in America was a name change, a change that was intended to take them further from their roots. Some of you may recall this particular scene from the movie Roots, when the main character, a slave recently brought to America, Kunta Kinte, is told he cannot use his African name any longer. Fiddler, an old Savia slave, wants Kunta Kinte to avoid being tortured by the overseers. So when Fiddler asks him his name, the young slave replies with pride, Kunta Kinte. No, that's your African name. Massa done give you a new name. Massa say your new name is Toby. But Kunta Kinte is determined to keep his name until the overseers strap Kunta Kinte to a tree, strips him to his waist, takes the whip, and demands that Kunta Kinte accept his new name. And the overseer lashes him across his back, demanding to know, "What's your name?" "Kunta Kinte," he cries. And the whip cracks across his back. "What's your name?" "Kunta Kinte," he cries. And the whip cracks across his back. "What's your name?" "Kunta Kinte." And the whip continues to crack until Kunta Kinte says, "Toby. My name is Toby." Slaves understood the power in names. They heard how God changed Abraham's name, changed Jacob's name to Israel, and how Saul's name was changed to Paul. And they understood that when your name was changed, you were changed.
I told Jesus it would be all right if he changed my name. I told Jesus it would be if he changed my name. I told Jesus it would be all right if he changed. Oh, if he changed my name.
And so slaves, through spirituals, came to peace with a change in their names. But still, their new lives in their new home was tough. Because in this land of hope and glory, proclaimed mother of the free, slaves were kept from maintaining the basic unit of any society, a family. Husbands and wives were sold without regard for their love and devotion. Children were ripped from mothers as soon as they were weaned from their breasts and sold. Brothers and sisters were torn in tears from each other's loving arms. As for the African American male, slave owners did their best to keep fathers from any connection to their biological families. The denial of family cohesion was one of slavery's most dehumanizing aspects, and perhaps is why, even to this very day, African Americans refer to one another as family. Somehow the intentional disruption of their biological families forged a bond that to this day makes everyone brother and sister. One of slavery's most devastating legacies was that it divested a substantial portion of the slaves' African culture from their lives and the lives of their children. Slaves were denied an understanding of their own history. No other Americans were forced to come to this country and then barred from celebrating the land from whence they came. No other ethnic group was brought to America bound in chains and then denied the opportunity to honor their heritage and the country of their birth. And no other Americans were barred by law from receiving a basic education. And because the law said that anyone teaching a slave to read or write could be executed, slaves devised a way of communicating that we call the spiritual code song. The code songs had a variety of meanings. It could mean that the traveling preacher was coming through, and so slaves needed to steal away to get ready for worship. And they needed to steal away quickly because the preacher couldn't stay long on the plantation. So you would hear a song rising from the fields as they sang, "Steal away, I ain't got long to stay here."
Jesus.
But steal away also meant that the Underground Railroad was ready to roll. And for those who were ready, willing, and able, it was time to steal away for the long, arduous, and dangerous journey on the Underground Railroad, bound as it was for an earthly promised land somewhere north or in Canada.
I am bound for the promised land. I am bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I am bound for the promised land.
Sometimes the preacher came and no one showed up for worship. And the preacher found himself all alone with God, and then the preacher would lament for all to hear how he couldn't hear nobody pray.
Lord, I couldn't hear nobody pray. Couldn't hear nobody pray. Oh, way down yonder by myself, and I couldn't hear nobody pray. Nobody pray on my knees. Couldn't hear nobody pray in my brother. Couldn't hear nobody pray. I'm the Savior. Couldn't hear nobody pray. Oh Lord, I couldn't hear nobody pray. Couldn't hear nobody pray. Oh, way down yonder by myself, and I couldn't hear nobody. Chilly waters in the Jordan, crossing over into Canaan. Oh Lord, couldn't hear nobody pray.
In their minds and hearts and spirits, slaves yearned for and nurtured a deep belief that one day they would be delivered from this dehumanizing life of servitude. And so for the slave, even death was more welcomed than a life of slavery. And these spirituals gave them hope that God would one day come and carry them home, set them free from their captivity, if not in this life, then the next. Sometimes slaves contemplating either freedom from the plantation or going back to Africa, or even the peace that death would bring them, sang about their deliverance. Swing low from the skies, they seemed to say. Swing low and carry me to that land of hope and glory. Carry me home to God. Swing low, sweet chariot was one of the songs of flight. And slaves imagined themselves flying from servitude, flying beyond misery, flying high over the slave masters, flying free from slavery, flying high over and away from the troubles of this world.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. I know coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me.
And even though slaves lived through our nation's own revolutionary war against the tyranny of Great Britain, and slaves hoped that when Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," it was devastating to discover that the new Constitution included the dehumanizing phrase that African Americans had been declared 3/5 of a human being. But still, they never gave up hope, and the spirituals they sang were a testament to their faith, and these songs gave them the strength to transcend their lives as slaves in America. And no matter how hard or how long they toiled, they held on to something within that said there is no way God would have brought them this far and just leave them. And though they were forced to breed like cattle, to work like horses, to live like animals, through sweat and strain, with bodies all aching and racked in pain, these slaves worked on, and they sang songs of encouragement to themselves and passed them down to generations not yet born. And though tired from back-breaking labor, they sang, "I don't feel no ways tired."
Sister, what's the matter?
Somebody's calling my name.
Trust my Jesus, she's a calling.
Hush.
Everybody.
Somebody's calling my name.
Well,
Hush.
aren't you ready
Hush.
for the judgment?
Somebody's calling my name. Oh my Lord, oh my Lord, what shall
I am seeking for a city.
Hallelujah.
I am seeking for a city.
Hallelujah.
For a city into the kingdom.
Hallelujah.
For to join that holy number.
Hallelujah. when this world is on fire.
They never gave up hope, and they kept faith in God's faithfulness to them to transcend their situation. These battered and abused slaves kept their spirits up and believed both in the freedom they prayed would come and the God they believed could and would free them. And so they did their best to obey their masters, believing if they kept their eyes on the freedom prize, one day they would be free. And so they tried to do right. And through these spirituals, they made a vow to remain faithful to God, no matter what.
Dawn made my vow to the Lord, and I never will turn back. I will go, I shall go to see what the end will be. Dawn opened my love to the Lord, and I never will turn back. Oh, I will go, I shall go to see what the end will be. The man who loves to serve the Lord, I will go, I shall go, will surely get his just reward. See what the end will be. Dawn made my vow to the Lord, and I never will turn back. I will go, I shall go, to see what the end will be. When every star refused to shine, I will go, I shall go. I know King Jesus will be mine. See what the end will be. Dawn made my vow to the Lord, and I never will turn back. I will go, I shall go, to see what the end will be. Sometimes I'm up, sometimes I'm down. I will go, I shall go, but still my soul feels heavenly bound. See what the end will be. Dawn made my vow to the Lord, and I never will turn back. I will go, I shall go, to see what the end will be. Dawn open my mouth to the Lord, and I never will turn back. Oh, I will go, I shall go to see what the end will be.
Those slaves believed deep in their hearts, morning, noon, and night, that the God of faith, hope, and justice would do what was right. And they cried out as they heard Job in all of his agony that the eternal God of the universe has to do what is right. And though he slay me, Job said, yet will I serve him. And so they worked on because there was so much to live for and so much work to be done if God's kingdom was to become a reality on earth as it is in heaven. And so they sang, I'm so busy working for the master, ain't got time to die. Of course, the master thought the song meant slaves would work harder, and so slave owners encouraged this song of obedience. But we know who and what they were really singing about.
Lord,
keep so busy praising my Jesus.
Keep so busy praising my Jesus. Keep so busy praising my Jesus. Ain't got time to die.
'Cause when I'm healing the sick, when I'm healing the sick, when I'm healing the sick,
Jesus ain't got time to die.
'cause it takes all of my time, all of my time.
Lord, if I don't praise him, the rock's gonna cry out.
Glory and honor, glory and honor.
Ain't got time to die.
Lord, I keep so busy working for the kingdom.
Keep so busy working for the kingdom. Keep so busy working for the kingdom. Ain't got time to die.
'Cause when I'm feeding the poor, when I'm feeding the poor, when I'm feeding the poor,
Ain't got time to die.
'cause it takes all of my time,
Jesus,
all of my time.
Lord, if I don't praise him, the rock's gonna cry out.
Glory and honor, glory and honor.
Ain't got time to die.
Lord, I keep so busy serving my master.
Keep so busy serving
my
master. Keep so busy serving my master. Ain't got time to die.
'Cause when I'm giving my all, when I'm giving my all, when I'm giving my all,
Ain't got time to die.
'cause it takes all of my time,
Jesus,
all of my time.
Lord, if I don't praise him, the rock's gonna cry out. Glory and honor, glory and honor. Ain't got time to die.
Don't you get out of my way,
Jesus,
get out of my way.
if I don't praise him, the rock's gonna cry out.
Glory and honor, glory and honor. Ain't got time to die.
These uneducated pieces of property took the worldview forced upon them and reworked it in their hearts and minds and souls so that they could survive the inhumanity they were compelled to endure, redesigning their lives and their faith for people who happened to be on that poor side of the equation. And so, though torn from their native land, though forbidden to speak their native language, though prohibited from celebrating their so-called primitive culture, though forced to learn, accept, and adapt to a hostile and foreign people, African American slaves created a way to survive, a song language of faith and hope through which they could communicate, and they had to, because they had a tough time understanding how the very masters that took their freedom and treated them like beasts of burden could call themselves children of God. Seeing the master up on the hill in his big house from their shacks in the valley, the slave had no choice but to rework the master's religion. And so they turned to a savior who was more like them, one who beckoned them to justice and freedom, one who had himself been persecuted, as if imploring their masters to actually practice the religion they had pushed upon them. African slaves sang songs of faith, even though they had a hard time understanding the teachings of the God they were compelled to worship. Just as the Jewish people before them ascended and transcended their hardships to greater glory, slaves climbed far above the grim realities of the cotton fields and whippings and families torn apart. And although they didn't have much in this life, they believed one day things would be different. So spirituals didn't so much focus on what was or what is, but on what could be. Not in this time, but in God's time. And so they sang about a time when life would be different. So they would sing that all God's children had robes, and all God's children had shoes, with a seemingly innocent spiritual, a rebellion of the soul took wings. Tried to tell the slaves, heaven is going to be segregated, with whites here and blacks there. So all we're trying to do is to help you get accustomed to how it's going to work in heaven, so that you won't make God angry when you get to heaven. But even as the master was talking, slaves were singing.
Everybody talking about heaven ain't going there, heaven.
When the master spoke of how the rules must be obeyed in heaven, and how the slave was simply in training to obey God's rules, the slaves had something to say about that too. Saying is, when we all get to heaven, we won't be restricted by your slave codes, but we're going to sing all over, we're going to shout all over, we're going to walk all over God's, not the master's, but walk all over God's heaven. Even more than the master, the slave understood who had the whole world in his hands. It wasn't the overseer, it wasn't the mistress of the plantation, it wasn't the master of the house, but it was the one who held the wind and the rain, the little bitty baby, and you and me, brother and sister, in his hands.
He's God. sister. In his hands he's got you and me, brother. In his hands he's got the whole world in his hands. He's got everybody. In his hands he's got everybody. In his hands he's got everybody. In his hands he's got the whole world in his
When slavery ended, those who survived it were subjected to another 100 years of Jim Crow laws and media portrayals of African American as inferior in every way. Unjust laws, hatred, murders, lynchings, night riders, the terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan, beatings, brutal rapings, cruel castrations, homes burned to the ground, and churches bombed. Much of this history, as hard as it is to believe, occurred within my lifetime, within our lifetimes. Yes, we've come a long way as a nation, and I hope that we will always remember this about our shared history as Americans, that if it is true that Europeans took Africans and made of them Americans, it is also true that the presence of African slaves helped to make of Europeans Americans. And what we have is a nation, a great nation that is better today than it was, a nation that has come to understand that people ought not to be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Yes, we've come a long ways, and together we've built this great nation, a land of hope, a land of glory. My brothers and sisters, ain't that good news?
I got a crown up in the kingdom, ain't that good news?
Ain't that good news?
I got a crown up in the kingdom, ain't that good news?
Ain't that good news? I'm gonna lay down this world, gonna shoulder up on my cross, gonna take it home to my Jesus. Ain't that good news?
Good news.
I gotta hop up in the kingdom. Ain't that good news?
Ain't that good news?
I gotta hop up in the kingdom. Ain't that good news?
Ain't that good news?
I'm gonna lay down this world, gonna shoulder up, gonna take it home to my Jesus. Ain't that good news?
Good news.
I gotta roll up in the kingdom. Ain't that good news? I gotta roll up in the kingdom. Ain't that good news? I'm gonna lay down this world, shoulder up my cross, gotta take it home to my Jesus. Ain't that good news? Good news.
I got a Savior in the kingdom, ain't that good news?
Ain't that good news?
I got a Savior in the kingdom,
Ain't that good news? Ain't that good news? I'm gonna lay down this world, gonna shoulder up my cross,
gonna take it home
to my Jesus. Ain't that good news?